Hey there, art nerds. Usually when someone tells me not to do something, I really have to fight the impulse to just turn around and do it. This is particularly true with art supplies, and while I am generally pretty good at fighting that impulse, sometimes I just can't help myself, and I wonder why they said that to begin with. So way back when we initially unboxed and swatched Marie's Chinese watercolors, both the economy set and the premium set, somewhere in the universe, either in the packaging or on the website, it recommends that you don't use these for Western style watercolors. Now, I really like the colors in the palette. I have enjoyed using similar but not the same palettes in the past, from Gensai style watercolors that utilize many of the same colors, to Holbein's Iridori line, which utilizes many of the same colors, to even the Paul Rubens watercolors, which utilize a very similar color palette. So I'm all about this color palette, but I couldn't help but wonder why we might not want to use Chinese watercolors for Western style watercolor. Now, having played around a smidgen, not as much as I would like, and I would love to take classes, but having played around with Chinese watercolor just a little bit, I do know they're quite different from Western style watercolors, from the binders used, which are typically like animal hide glues versus, gum arabic or honey, to how the pigment is granulated, generally being a little bit more coarse than many Western style watercolors, leading to more opaque colors, to even how these colors are mixed and handled. Chinese watercolors are designed to be used on both sides of the paper, so you can do undercolor by kind of painting on the reverse side of the paper, which is just not an option if you're using Western style watercolors. They're actually a very different animal from Western style watercolors. And when I say Western style watercolors, I mean European style watercolors, where you have very fine granulation generally, and your binder is gum arabic or honey or something of the sort. But just because they're different doesn't mean they're not just as awesome, and it doesn't mean they're not fun to play and to paint with. They're also generally a little bit cheaper than their like Sennelier or Winsor & Newton counterparts. Now, I would not recommend doing this on the daily. I would not recommend just using Chinese watercolors with your Western watercolors willy-nilly. But if you're careful and if you understand watercolor, you can have a lot of fun using Marie's premium Chinese watercolors for Western style techniques, which is what we're going to do today. So I have here a sketch. It's kind of inspired by Qipao Lolita, and that is a form of fashion that's inspired by Qipao dresses. So I combine that along with cherry blossoms, because I really just like cherry blossoms, and I really just like drawing and painting cherry blossoms, and also the colors in the Marie's palette kind of remind me of cherry blossoms. Now, I think I showed you guys earlier, I had an illustration that I did last year that I used the Mozart Komorebi palette for, and it's just some cherry blossoms, and that's kind of the technique I'm hoping to recreate with this today. And I am painting on Blick's Premier watercolor paper, so this is a 100% cotton rag watercolor block. I don't have to stretch it, it's been stretched for me, and this has been sketched with red lead. I think it's like Pintel in 0.05. So all that's really left is to go ahead and paint it. And for today's video, for today's demonstration, for today's watercolor illustration, I am going to paint first, and then I'm going to ink on top of it. And I think I'm going to use the Acacia thin line brush pens for that, since they have a color palette that just seems to mesh really well with the colors that we have here. So pretty much all of the colors in the Marie's premium Chinese watercolor set are more opaque colors, and part of that is because Chinese style watercolor is designed to be done or to be accomplished utilizing mainly strong, confident brush strokes, so the majority of your imagery is captured in the brush strokes themselves, rather than my, I guess, way of watercoloring, which tends to be a little bit more color by number. I'm definitely very inspired by Chinese watercolor and the confidence in the brushwork, and I am trying to adopt more of that into my art with my metallic beta fish being an excellent example of that, but I still have a long way to go, and I would really love to take some in-person classes because, you know, some of us do learn better in person rather than online. Some of us need that directed guidance, and you know, sometimes it's easier to carve the time out in your life if you have a class you actually have to go to, because like I have a million videos of Chinese watercolor and Korean watercolor and Taiwanese watercolor in my watch later feed that I'm probably never going to get to. So the way I handle watercolor is I tend to do a million layers, and sometimes that can result in some really muddy watercolor, and sometimes that can result in some really beautiful optical blending. It's a bit of a toss-up. But with the Chinese watercolors, I knew I wasn't going to be able to do a million layers. I needed to try and work with these watercolor strengths and work with what I know about these watercolors. This is absolutely not intended to be a tutorial, and while I enjoyed creating this painting and I'm really happy with how it turned out, I can't vouch for the results time and time again. There was a period a couple years ago where I was spending a lot of time studying the formulation of Gansai watercolors and Chinese watercolors and the different types of watercolors that are available over there. And I actually still have this like mostly written blog post that's like a book in length all about that. So I'd spent a lot of time learning about these as an art supply, and I'm utilizing a lot of what I learned back then to try and make this as successful as possible. Now, one of the things that I really like about these watercolors is the granulation. You're going to get a lot of granulation and there's a lot of opacity. So you really need to work with that rather than trying to fight it. And the color palette itself, first of all, this came with 2 green number 2s rather than a brown type of color like a burnt sienna or a umber, an earth style pigment. So I had to mix all of the browns myself because whoever packed the set initially kind of goofed and made a little bit of a mistake. And that's not too hard. You can use color theory for this, but it's going to require a lot of swatching and a lot of testing. So a few things to keep in mind before you even begin painting. Some colors are just flat out going to be opaque, like those light blues and those light greens, and trying to mix them with non-opaque colors or layer them will result in mud. It's best to just embrace these colors for the properties they have rather than trying to force them into something they aren't. And these are the professional quality Maries. A while back I compared the economy and the professional, and I really do like the professional ones. So if you want to play around with Chinese watercolors, the professional quality Maries are really nice, and they're typically what's recommended if you're not going to go the more traditional route where you mix as you go. I have no experience with the mix as you go. I would love to play with those in the future, so keep an eye out for that. But, you know, compared to other tube style Chinese watercolors, the professional quality Maries are generally what's recommended, including by like Blue Heron Arts, which on that note, if you're looking for tutorials, if you're looking for inspiration, Blue Heron Arts has a YouTube channel, and I believe they have a blog where they explain a lot of this. So if you're interested in getting started, that's a great place to start. I also need to point out we don't have any affiliation, and they probably would not approve of me doing this. So this is me going rogue, doing my own thing. Now, the professional quality Maries handle similarly to Holbein's now defunct Iridori line. And I love the colors in the Iridori line. I'm a big fan of muted pastels and softer colors. Those are kind of my preferred palette. So I actually really like the palette here. The only thing I'm missing is the brown. And it's best to try to work with the colors in the palette and let it inspire your work, which is what inspired the Cherry Blossoms to begin with. Is this set has some really, really nice pinky reds and reddish reds. I believe like vermilion, and I'd have to look up the other color. I'm so sorry. Now, like I said, my set doesn't have a brown, but there are sets with browns, or you could add one in. I was able to mix browns using orange, maroon, and indigo, so a little color theory is really helpful. I was also able to mix a skin tone using the same basic mixing principles. Now, I do talk about how to mix skin tones in several videos, so if you're interested in that, I can link that for you guys. Now, many of these colors have gorgeous shading capabilities. Peony red, and peony red is the pinkish red I was literally just talking about and I couldn't remember the name. That's the name. It's an excellent example. You can go from super light pastel pink like you see me doing here with the cherry blossoms, and then I'm just dipping in a darker, more saturated version of the exact same color from the half pan, and you can see how much difference you can get in the colors. Now, for this part, I'm dual wielding. That's something that I do all the time. Sometimes I'll even paint with like 3 or 4 brushes, and that's another Chinese watercolor technique that I think is really cool and I highly recommend. Unfortunately, it's kind of difficult to demonstrate on camera here. I also want to point out that this has been time-lapsed to varying degrees. I'm using VN Editor to edit it, which allows me to time-lapse all the way up to 8x, and it also lets me do montage style where some areas in a segment are faster or slower than others. It took me about an evening to paint, so let's say from 6 to midnight, and then the next morning I went in and added a few final details. So let's be generous and say an extra hour there, so about 7 hours to complete this piece. And I both feel like I'm a very fast and a very slow watercolor artist. I'm not as quick as some of the people who are able to capture a lot using just a couple of layers and a lot of wet into wet blending, but I'm also not, it doesn't take me as long as people who have really refined, detailed illustration styles. So I'm just somewhere in the middle there. So like I mentioned earlier, most of these colors are going to be opaque or semi-opaque. Generally, Chinese watercolors seem to be not as finely milled as, you know, Sennelier or Winsor Newton, or even Daniel Smith, but that kind of varies. That is not a quality thing. They're just different watercolors. They're different types of watercolors, so they have different properties. And this can lead to some really beautiful granulation, but you really need to limit the number of glazes and layers you apply to prevent mud. Now, I have looked at buying additional colors from the permanent, wow. I've looked at buying additional colors from the premium Marie's line. They only seem to sell those colors in sets of 3. Like if you were a teacher and there's colors you use frequently and you want to refill those, and I'm just not gonna commit to a set of 3 tubes just to get some extra colors. From the get-go, I could have purchased a larger set. I believe it's available in 2 sizes, but I'm sure one of you guys will let me know. And I think I definitely mentioned it in the actual unbox and swatch video a while back. I think I have the 12 color set here, and it did come with a white, which I don't use, and it came with 2 tubes of the exact same green. Something else that's really interesting about Chinese watercolor is in general you don't do a lot of color mixing. At the most you might mix 2 colors. You're not going to be doing that too often. Like a very popular combination is like indigo and a yellow in order to get this really fresh green color. But what you will also do is like double load your brush. So pick up some of the indigo and some of the yellow and allow it to kind of blend on the brush itself, which is a technique I think is so cool. And I have had no success with it in my attempts, but that is why I would like to take the class and learn from somebody who can tell me what I'm doing wrong in person. Now, earlier I said you're going to want to limit the number of glazes you do. You can layer the same color in varying saturations over and over again, like you guys see me doing here with peony red, and it doesn't seem to have much of an issue. Something else is I would not do this, just me personally. I would not be doing this on a cellulose paper or even a mixed paper where it's like 25% cotton or 50% cotton. I would only try this on a 100% cotton rag paper that I actually have experience with. And I've painted on the Blick Studio watercolor paper a lot. I do most of my unbox and swatch tests on this paper. I'm very familiar with it and I know what it can and what it cannot do. So if you want to do something similar to this, which again, I'm not necessarily recommending, I would recommend you use a paper that doesn't have a lot of external sizing on it, something that's really going to hold on to those pigments. And that's one of the reasons I would not use a cellulose paper for this, because everything kind of sits on top of cellulose papers. If you want to try this on a rice paper, go for it. I'm sure you're more experienced than I am and know what you're doing. That is something I would kind of struggle with, but I kind of struggle with rice papers to begin with. I do like to play around with washi style papers, like different types of origami paper, and many of those utilize a rice paper or a mulberry paper. But even there, I generally try to keep it very, very simple with only a few layers and really let the paints wet into wet blend in order to capture what I'm looking to capture. On that note, I have an entire series on how to paint different spring flowers here on the channel. I'll link it in the description below. One of the illustrations from that series, the cherry blossoms, inspired this illustration here, so I'd really love it if you checked it out. And I complete that whole series using the Mozart Komorebi set, which is very similar to a Gansai style watercolor. I also want to point out, before I offend anybody with my ignorance, because there's always going to be gaps in your knowledge if you don't grow up in a culture, and I'm not trying to speak for people in that culture. I'm only speaking for myself and the research that I've done, and that is the end of that. I'm not trying to say that Japanese watercolors, Chinese watercolors, Korean watercolors, and Taiwanese watercolors are all the same. They're very different. They have some similarities. They tend to utilize similar color palettes. They tend to sometimes utilize similar binders and similar processes, but they are different things. So I'm kind of borrowing from a lot of different traditions, and I'm also kind of corrupting it and doing my own thing with it. But I really highly recommend you check out the different schools of this type of watercolor, of Chinese, of Japanese, of Korean, of Taiwanese watercolor, and let that inspire your work, because here in the US, we don't talk about it enough. We don't really talk about it in academic circles. If you were taking a fine art class, unless it was like an Asian fine art class, it wouldn't come up, and that is such a shame. I legitimately feel like we are very cheated by not discussing that, by not having Asian art as an important part of our artistic curriculum. We are being denied a really important, not only source of inspiration, but source of heritage and source of knowledge. And frequently their processes are better documented than, say, the great Italian masters' processes are documented, with like the exception of Da Vinci. So we're really missing out in the US by that not being more of an option, not something that is taught regularly. And I think part of the problem is that here in the US, because it can be more accessible to learn Chinese watercolor because it's based on certain brush strokes, it is treated like a hobby and it's not taken seriously enough. But I think it deserves a lot more respect than it gets here in the US. And it can be difficult as a white person, sorry, in Louisiana and in Tennessee, to find information, to find references, to find classes on this. It can be difficult to find that. And I do think it would be amazing to bring this art form to the US and to make classes more available and make the materials more available and basically make it an art form that is commonly taught. So if you're familiar with Louisiana and you know someone who teaches this, please let me know in the comments. Once COVID is over, or we're further along, or there is some light at the end of the tunnel, I would love to take Chinese watercolor classes. I would love to learn in person, and I think it would open up a whole world of inspiration and potential for me. As I mentioned earlier, I'm already watching time-lapse tutorials, but for me it can be difficult to pick up on what's going on with time-lapse if I don't understand the language and there aren't subtitles. So I would love to learn in person. So at this point, I'm trying to get the hair dark enough. Again, for the third time, maybe the fourth time. My set did not come with a brown. It would have made it so much easier if it came with a brown. But a little bit of color theory can go a long way. And I'm pretty satisfied with the brown I was able to mix. Again, with Chinese watercolors, you might mix some sumi ink in order to get these darker colors. You wouldn't necessarily have a black watercolor in your set, you would mix in some ink, and there are different shades of black that would be useful for mixing different things. I am not utilizing that in this instance. Like I said, this is not an example of Chinese watercolor. This is me using Chinese watercolor in a way it wasn't necessarily designed to be used, to see if it would work for that. And this is such a your mileage may vary situation. The longer I've been in art, the more I see that there is not necessarily any one right way to do things. There isn't any one right way to get from point A to point B, that everyone's artistic journey is so different that it's almost not worth talking about how you got there, because they're not going to be able to replicate that. And that's not an excuse for me not to talk about things and not to share tutorials and stuff, but it's really me encouraging you, if you want to try this, try it, and be prepared to totally change what is done in order to best suit what you want to accomplish. So I really wanted to do something more interesting with the top layer on her dress. I really wanted it to kind of look like there's a frilly, soft underlayer like cherry blossoms, and then on top of it, maybe a satin layer. And I also wanted to take advantage of the ability to shade, peony's red ability to shade from one color to another. So I'm using peony red and some clean water to create an ombre on her dress. So when I was newer to watercolor, when I had less experience with watercolor, I really didn't like opaque colors in watercolor, because for me, they were a tripping point. I would make a lot of mud with them. They'd kind of slough off the papers that I was using. I just really didn't like opaque colors. But now that I've been painting for a lot longer, and I've tried all sorts of different brands, and I've tried all sorts of different papers, I really am starting to like opaque watercolors, particularly when they're premium opaque watercolors. A while back, I wrote a blog post about optical brighteners, which it's like adding talc or titanium white to watercolors in order to make them look brighter in their mass tone, to make them look brighter in the half pans, but that even though those look bright and appealing like candy and they really capture our imagination, you're really being cheated, because not only are you getting less pigment in those pans, but they're going to tend to paint like mud or paint like chalk and may even flake off the paper. And those little round half pans that Artist Loft and Angora make, and I've talked about those here on the channel, so I'll link those. They're very popular in like aspirational art circles. They may be popular still with brush letters. They used to be. They look so good in their pans, and they look so good when they're still wet, but as soon as they dry, they basically dry to chalk, and they're very challenging to mix, and it's challenging to get saturated color, and you can't layer with them, and you can't really paint on top of them. They're like gouache, if gouache was 3 times more painful but way cheaper. That was my experience for a long time with quote-unquote opaque watercolors, were those crummy, painful things, or like fan color, where it's more of like a temporal watercolor than a true watercolor. But as I've been playing around with more Japanese brands and with more Chinese brands, like with the Paul Rubens tube sets, which I actually reviewed not too long ago, I've really come to appreciate quality brands that have opaque and semi-opaque colors, because they really open up a lot of potential and a lot of possibility for doing these really cool atmospheric glazes. And to make those work, you really got to use the right paper for them. And I bring this up because a lot of the colors in this Chinese set are opaque, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily full of optical brighteners in order to make a cheaper product. They have a lot of, sometimes or traditionally, they would use like ground shell or calcium in order to get those whites. It's because they are typically designed to be painted in only a couple of layers with no glazes on top of them. And that's just, it's a different way of handling the material, and they're designed for a different paper, and they're designed to be more permanent. So in this instance, I'm using the 2 greens that came in the set. I think it's like green 1 and green 2, and they may be made from malachite if I'm remembering correctly, but I'm sure one of you guys will let me know. And I kind of struggled with these because I love those colors. I have always loved this sort of like light celadon green. But I didn't want to do just kind of like straight up green with no shading and no nuance for her jacket and for the piping and for the tassels. So I mixed in, or I layered on a little bit of indigo, and then it got kind of dark for me, and then I tried to layer it back and kind of worked it a little bit much. It turned out all right in the end. But this was an area that I kind of struggled with, because instead of just trusting the paints, I kind of messed around with them a little bit too much. So here's another example coming up soon. I'm still messing around with the indigo and trying to get a nice diffused effect. And I kind of broke my own rule. You know, you got to KISS. You got to keep it simple, stupid with these. You shouldn't overthink it. You shouldn't overwork it. It's best if you just get in, do what you're going to do, and then get out. But here is an example of creating that ombre effect. So I've applied some pretty straight from the half pan peony red, and I'm going to just slowly bring it down and mix it with water so that we can add transparency, lighten the color, and create our ombre effect. That's something else I wanted to mention with this. So generally with Chinese watercolors, you don't really work from dried half pans. You work straight fresh from the tube. You apply it to, say, a ceramic palette or a ceramic ramekin. You add your water as you go, and then I guess if you can like let it dry on the palette and then reconstitute it that way, or you can start fresh. It kind of depends on what materials and how much space you have. You don't usually dry them out in half pans. They're really not designed for that. I did it because I'm just breaking all the rules today, and I found that they did reconstitute. Now, I did need to drop a lot of water on them and then give them a real chance to soak up that water. And I did need to add water as I went to kind of keep them fresh. And because they don't have a hydrophilic binder, that's a binder that loves water and is going to draw water from the atmosphere. So like honey, like grams tends to stay sticky and doesn't always set up in your palette. That's because it's a hydrophilic watercolor and it's pulling water from the air. And gum arabic is somewhat hydrophilic, but not as hydrophilic as honey. And that's why cheaper watercolors in general, not talking about Marie's here, just talking about cheaper watercolors, they'll use other binders, sometimes glycerin, sometimes really cheap gum arabic, and they just don't handle as well as the nicer watercolors. Well, Chinese watercolors don't use, to my knowledge, I mean, Paul Rubens might. They might be using gum arabic now in general because that's a commonly available watercolor material. Sometimes what is popular and cheap in other parts of the world can influence art supplies in other countries. So I can't speak to this, but I'm sure you guys can know. Or sure one of you guys knows and will tell me. I would really appreciate it. Traditionally, binders for Chinese and Japanese watercolors are made with an animal hide glue. I think Korean watercolors also traditionally use an animal hide glue, and it can be sold in a powdered form, and you ladle in water and mix as you go, and you add in the pigment and mix that all together. Or you can buy it in a liquid form, like I have a bottle of Shinhan animal hide glue binder. So I don't know what the binder is with these Marie's tube watercolors. If you do, let me know down in the comments. I'm very curious, to be honest. It did reconstitute though. It just isn't going to reconstitute the same way something that utilizes gum arabic or honey would. And that also means they're more prone to kind of cracking in the half pans and falling out of the half pans. So just in general, I would not recommend setting them up in half pans the way I did. If you really want to have a Chinese watercolor palette that's prepared for you, I would recommend getting either a Paul Rubens palette or a Magello palette, where it's like an airtight palette and you have a larger working space and it keeps the paints fresh longer. You can also find those palettes on AliExpress that have like a silicone gasket to help keep them fresh. Like I talked about the Superior collapsible watercolor cup. That kind of gasket would also work really well with Chinese watercolors. Basically, palettes that work well for keeping wash fresh would work well for keeping Chinese watercolors fresh. But even though I did things totally wrong, it still turned out okay. They still reconstituted. I was able to mix them. I didn't have any that just absolutely refused to rework. So maybe I lucked out. So I also want to point out that opaque and semi-opaque watercolors, when you finally learn how to use them, are so wonderful for slightly modifying color or adding color in. So here I've used the yellow to paint in some extra leaves on top of the blue sky, and I'm adding a little bit of yellow mixed with indigo to kind of start shading them. If the yellow was fully transparent, it wouldn't stand out nearly as well. You can definitely see it on the cherry blossom leaves. It adds this really nice pop of color. And that's something I've grown to like about high quality opaque and semi-opaque watercolors, is how much it actually allows you to really adjust your painting and add back in color and add back in contrast that you might have otherwise started to lose. So at this point, I'm just kind of quote unquote inking things, like adding a little bit of a peony red outline to some of the cherry blossoms just to adjust the contrast, and just in general noodling around and adjusting the contrast, which is what I always do at this stage of the painting when I'm basically done with it. Now I do try to vary the shots so that you guys can see what I'm doing and also to add more interest, but I hope you guys noticed that I was using a ceramic palette to mix my colors, and I was also able to reconstitute the colors using a little bit of water or a damp brush even after those colors had dried in the palette. So that about wraps it up with the watercolor. I kind of finessed it longer than I intended to. It's just a bad habit of mine, trying to clean things up or make them look better when they were fine to begin with. It's a bit of a time waste, really. So these were the main materials I used: Marie's Premium Chinese watercolors, a small tin with half pans in them, a ceramic palette for mixing. I also used Western style watercolor brushes, so instead of like sumi brushes or Chinese watercolor brushes, I used silver black velvet mixed brushes, which are synthetic and natural fibers, and Kolinsky sable brushes, mostly because that's what I am more comfortable with, and I have more of them in the smaller sizes I needed for this. Next, I want to ink it a little bit using Akashia's thin line brush pens. So these, I've talked about these here on the channel. They are alcohol marker proof and waterproof. I could have inked this first, but I like doing the inking after with certain pieces because it helps things stay fresh and loose, and I also don't have to ink as much, frankly. So as I've mentioned so many times, my eyesight is not great, and even though I'm wearing glasses, I have to get all on top of it to see what I'm doing. So I hope you guys will forgive the intrusion of me and my glasses in this piece. So one of the things I like about these thin line brush pens is that they come in like the Boko Undo Sumi-esque colors. So they're like black plus a color. So you have like a burgundy, you have like a dark teal, you have like an indigo, you have a sepia, you have... It's supposed to be like a yellow black, but to me it feels like a fur green kind of black. Basically, if you're a fan of Platinum's carbon black inks, you will not carbon black, the Iron Gall inks that are like black plus a color. I'm sorry, I forgot. You'll really like these. I really like these. I love bright color, but I also love muted colors, and I love being able to utilize them together to create a nicer whole. So normally I would use white gouache to add in highlights, gouache being a semi-opaque or an opaque watercolor. But hey, there is already a semi-opaque to opaque white watercolor in the Marie set. So I'm using the white that came with the Marie set, and I'm using it just straight from the tube the way I normally would do with gouache, which is a little bit water that's already on the brush, and maybe just kind of mix it on a ceramic palette in order to get the paint and the water better mixed. Not only did I use it to add in highlights to like hair and eyes and to satin, but I'm also going to use it to do a floral surface design on the top layer of her dress. And I'm referencing different brocades for inspiration here, and there's some really gorgeous elaborate patterns that I would not be able to recreate. So I'm going for a really simple kind of iconographic depiction of cherry blossom sprays. So that about wraps it up for creating a more Western, I guess. I don't want to say it like that because there's lots of people who use this art style. A not traditional Chinese watercolor illustration utilizing traditional Chinese watercolors. I'm using Marie's premium Chinese watercolors. I also use the Acacia thin line brush pins for this, in addition to a small ceramic palette, some half pans, and Blick Studio cotton rag watercolor paper. I really enjoyed using these opaque and semi-opaque watercolors to paint this illustration. And while I'm not telling you to go out and do that because frankly you might end up disappointed, it was a fun exercise that really kind of tested what I knew about different types of watercolors and challenged me to mix my own skin tones and hair tones from non-obvious solutions. So my advice, if you're gonna do what I do, despite what I say, and use the Marie's premium Chinese watercolors for other types of watercolor, is keep it simple. Limit the number of layers you're going to use. Ideally, don't do too much color mixing unless you just absolutely have to, like I had to here. and work with the color palette that you actually have. I would also recommend working with the paints while they're still fresh. It's just a better painting experience if you can, rather than trying to reconstitute half pans like I did here. That's not such a great solution. And there's all kinds of palettes on the market designed to keep your paints still wet and still fresh and easy to work with. So I had a blast painting this. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it. If you like what I do and you want to help me continue to do work like this, please join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. If you'd like to keep up with my art, please consider following me on Instagram. Bye guys.